Think you're having a bad day because your phone died, or your morning coffee wasn't quite right? Now imagine waking up not in a soft bed, but on a pile of damp straw, teeming with lice, next to, yes, a neighbor's chicken. Welcome to England, circa 1325, a world where most people never travel more than 10 miles from where they were born. And you've just opened your eyes as a medieval peasant. No hot showers, no toilets, no privacy, no weekends. Just one quiet, relentless mission. Survive one more day. And yet, somehow, people did more than survive. They laughed. They loved. They held onto hope with calloused hands and tired hearts. That's what makes this story worth telling. So dim the lights, grab a warm cup of tea, and let's time travel together. Not to castles or thrones, but to mud huts and morning misery. Today, you're going to live, just for a little while, like a medieval peasant. And by the end of this video, you might just want to hug your mattress. Imagine this. You open your eyes to a low, gray ceiling, dimly lit by the sliver of light squeezing. Through cracks in the wooden wall, there's no alarm clock, just the echo of the village church bell clanging in the distance. The sound is cold, metallic, and merciless. It's not asking you to wake up. It's commanding you. You're not in your bed. There are no pillows, no Egyptian, cotton sheets, no memory foam cradling your spine. Instead, you lie on a lumpy pile of straw stuffed into a sack, if you're lucky. If not, it's just loose straw dumped onto the dirt floor, flattened over time by your own tired body. And the smell? It hits you before you even sit up. A heavy blend of wet wool, old sweat, manure, and something unidentifiable but deeply unpleasant. The kind of smell that clings to your hair, your skin, and your memories. This is not a one-person room. There are no bedrooms in your medieval home. It's one shared space, open plan, in the worst way imaginable. You, your spouse, your children, your cousin who never left, a few chickens, maybe a goat. You're all huddled together under one sagging roof. Everyone breathes the same air. Everyone shares the same smells. Everyone snores. And your mattress, it's not just lumpy, it's alive. Lice, fleas, bedbugs. You can feel them crawling, especially around your ankles and neck. You scratch automatically, not because you're surprised, but because it's just part of the morning routine. Like brushing your teeth, except you won't be doing that either. We'll get there. Let's talk about that straw mattress for a moment. It might have been fresh once, but now it's soggy from the roof dripping rain and dusty from the dirt floor below. If your roof is thatched, and it probably is, then last night's storm likely leaked straight through. The mattress smells like the barn floor, because let's be honest, 3 months ago, that's exactly where it came from. The blanket wrapped around you is made of rough wool. No color, no pattern, just a dull, scratchy gray. It hasn't been washed since last winter and now weighs as much as a small farm animal from all the grime it's absorbed. You pull it off reluctantly, and the cold hits you like a slap. There's no insulation, no heat. The only warmth comes from the body heat of those you sleep beside, human and otherwise. And yet you get up, because you have to. No one is going to wait for you to feel rested. In medieval Europe, rest is a luxury for the dying. You swing your legs over the side of the mattress and immediately regret it. The dirt floor is either muddy from the leak or crusty from last night's, let's just say, mystery spill. Barefoot, as usual, your feet squish and crunch in turn. Welcome to your first step of the day. You are now part of the ecosystem. There are no rugs, no indoor shoes, no slippers, no privacy. And yet, despite everything, this is normal. This is daily life for 90% of the people in medieval Europe. You don't question it. You don't complain. You just go on. Historical records describe these huts in chilling detail. One room, thatched roof, mud or wattle and daub walls, with animals kept inside during winter to share heat. The straw mattress, called a pallet, was considered an improvement over sleeping directly on the ground. Some even stuffed it with hay or rags if they couldn't afford straw. The shared sleeping arrangement wasn't a sign of poverty, it was the norm. One bed, one blanket, no doors to close, no space to retreat into. Your dreams, your smells, your sounds, all public. And while this might sound like a horror story to us, back then, this was just life. People adapted. They found ways to laugh through the itch, to whisper stories in the dark, to hold each other when the wind howled through the cracks. Because when comfort is absent, connection becomes everything. So what can we take from this? Maybe it's this. Gratitude isn't about having everything. It's about recognizing how much we already have. The warmth of a quiet bedroom, a door that shuts, clean sheets, a dry floor. These aren't small luxuries. They're modern miracles. So the next time you stretch under your blanket and feel the softness of cotton or the quiet hum of a heater, maybe, just maybe, whisper a thank you. Not to anyone in particular, but to time, to history, to the unknown. Peasant who never got to sleep in peace, because for them, waking up wasn't the beginning of another comfortable day. It was the first step into another battle for survival, and the battle continues, because now nature is calling. But there's no bathroom, no running water, and certainly no flush. Only a wooden bucket. Maybe, if you're lucky. So take a deep breath. Because next up, we're going outside, so you've managed to pry yourself out of that damp, itchy bed. Congratulations, you've survived the first test of medieval living. Now let's talk about the second test. One that comes for us all. Nature is calling. Loudly. And you, medieval peasant that you are, have no bathroom. There is no porcelain toilet, no sink, no tiled walls. Not even a wooden outhouse with a little crescent moon carved in the door. That romantic idea? That's a luxury for much later in history. In 1325, if you're a typical peasant living in a village hut, your toilet is likely a wooden bucket tucked behind your house. If you're really poor, or just out of luck, you might squat in the field or behind a bush. That's your version of privacy. Let's paint the picture. You step outside, holding your tunic to keep it from dragging through the mud. The morning air is cold and heavy. Dew glistens on the thatch roofs. Chickens cluck lazily in the distance. And there it is, your family's communal waste bucket, already filled to the brim, because Uncle Godric had a rough night with some bad turnips. And the smell? It could rival a battlefield. You hold your breath, do what needs to be done, and then comes the medieval twist. What to do with the waste? You toss it, out the window, into the street, onto the path where people walk, children play, carts roll by. But first, of course, you shout, "Garde l'eau," Old French for "watch out for the water." Though really it's not water at all. It's a slurry of human waste, animal droppings, and bits of unidentifiable gunk that's been collecting in the gutter for weeks. Spoiler alert, people rarely move fast enough. The streets of a medieval town weren't cobblestone romance. They were open sewers, quite literally. Waste flowed through them in channels, mixing with rainwater, blood from the butcher, rotting vegetables, and whatever else people didn't want inside their homes. And no, shoes weren't waterproof. Many people didn't even wear them. If you lived in a city like London or Paris, you might find public latrines, stone benches with holes that emptied into pits or rivers. But these were rare, and they offered zero privacy. Just you, a stranger, and the vague hope you're not being watched. As for toilet paper, that didn't exist. People wiped with whatever they could find, rags, moss, straw, leaves, or their own tunic if desperate. The rich might use wool scraps. The poor, well, let's just say hands-on was sometimes taken literally. No wonder. Handshakes didn't catch on, and here's something that might shock you. Castles weren't much better. Sure, lords had garderobes, basically stone seats built into the castle wall, where waste dropped straight down into the moat. Yes, That same moat soldiers were expected to wade through during battle. In fact, during some sieges, invading troops would sneak into castles through those waste shafts. Talk about entering through the back door. There's a reason the phrase filthy rich has medieval roots. So why was sanitation so terrible? Partly, it was ignorance. Germ theory wouldn't come around for another 500 years. People didn't know bacteria existed. They thought illness came from bad air or imbalanced humors, not from stepping in someone's breakfast leftovers. But it was also about survival. When your day is a constant battle to feed your family, clean streets aren't the priority. Comfort comes second. Cleanliness comes last. And here's the thing. Everyone knew the system was bad. There are records from medieval town councils complaining about waste being dumped too close to wells. People got sick. Outbreaks happened. But change came slowly. Infrastructure costs money, and peasants didn't have any. So, what can we take from all this? Maybe this. The next time you walk into your clean bathroom, close the door, flush the toilet, wash your hands with warm running water, pause, just for a second. And remember that for most of human history, something that feels so basic to us today was a dream no one could even imagine, because dignity starts in small places. And yes, sometimes it starts with plumbing. But don't get too comfortable, because now that you've done your business, it's time to eat. And in the Middle Ages, breakfast isn't comfort food, it's survival. Let's head back inside, shall we? You've survived the mattress, you've braved the bucket, and now, as your stomach lets out its first low growl of the day, it's time for breakfast. But if you're imagining a cozy bowl of oatmeal, maybe a fried egg, a buttery slice of toast, or, dare we dream, a warm cup of coffee, you might want to sit down. Preferably not on your straw bed, because in medieval Europe, breakfast wasn't a pleasure. It wasn't even a real meal, at least not in the way we think of one. Today, it was an obligation, a moment of fuel before labor, and for most peasants, it was as bland, repetitive, and joyless as the workday ahead. Let's set the scene. You squat near the small hearth at the center of your one-room hut. The fire from last night has long gone cold. You try to coax a few embers back to life while your breath rises in pale clouds. Maybe you're lucky enough to have a cooking pot that survived generations. Maybe it's cracked and patched with wire, but it holds together. Barely. Inside is pottage. Again. Pottage is what you'd get if soup and porridge had a baby, then left it unattended for a week. It's a thick, gloopy stew made of grains, root, vegetables, and whatever else was available, which in winter is not much. Cabbage, leeks, maybe a carrot or turnip if you're lucky. Beans or lentils if they survived the rats. There's no meat. That's reserved for feast days or rich people. Eggs? Rare. Cheese? Possibly, but only if you've managed to keep a goat alive through the cold. And even then, it's more likely to smell like feet than cheddar. This pot of pottage has been simmering on and off for days, sometimes even weeks. New scraps are added on top as they come in. There is no start over. It's an ongoing edible experiment. A medieval slow cooker without the electricity or hygiene. On the side, if you have it, is bread. But this isn't the fluffy sourdough you might find at your local bakery. No, this bread is coarse and dense, made from rye or barley flour. Wheat is far too expensive. Sometimes, to stretch the flour, it's mixed with things like ground acorns or sawdust. Yes, sawdust. The loaf is so hard you don't slice it. You negotiate with it. Some folks would dunk it straight into the pottage to soften it, hoping it doesn't break a tooth. And what do you wash it down with? Beer, yes. Beer for breakfast, even for the kids. But not the kind of beer you sip at a weekend BBQ. This is small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew that's less about enjoyment and more about survival. Why? Because the water is unsafe. Teeming with parasites, human waste, and animal runoff. Boiling it into beer made it drinkable. So, every morning, you raise a wooden mug of lukewarm, slightly sour ale and gulp it down. It's not a celebration. It's just what you do. Historical records tell us this was the standard for centuries. In fact, many households kept a pot of pottage on the fire nearly constantly. In some homes, the same pot was used by 3 generations, never truly cleaned. The food inside was ever-changing, but the base, the same sludgy spirit. Still hungry? Let's say you lived in a coastal village or near a river. You might have access to small fish, eels, herrings, or freshwater perch, but catching them takes time, tools, and the Lord's permission. Everything you own technically belongs to Him, even the fish in your own backyard. What about fruit? Maybe in summer, apples or berries when they're in season, but no fridges, no canning jars, no freezers. Winter means pickled vegetables, dried legumes, and lots of praying for spring. And spices? Don't even think about it. A pinch of pepper cost more than a farm laborer earned in a month. Cinnamon and nutmeg. Those were reserved for royal feasts and church elites. Your flavor comes from onions, garlic, or smoke. Lots of smoke. And still, you eat. You chew slowly, letting the warmth settle in your stomach. It's not delicious, but it's something. And when your world offers so little, even something is enough. That's the strange beauty of it. People found ways to endure. They shared their food, passed down recipes, and joked about how last week's rat might have been the secret ingredient. They found meaning, even in meals that barely qualified as such. Because food, at its core, is about more than taste. It's about survival, community, continuity. It says, we're still here, and maybe that's the lesson we carry with us. We bite. Live in a time where we can choose our breakfast, from cereals to smoothies, bagels to bacon. But choice is a modern miracle. And not so long ago, there was no menu, just a pot, some grain, and the will to keep going. So tomorrow morning, when you pour your coffee and scroll your phone, take one quiet second. Look down at your plate, whatever's on it, and whisper a soft thank you to the people who came before. The ones who survived pottage and hunger and winters without oranges so that you could sit, eat, and complain about the price of oat milk. But now there's no time to linger. You've eaten, sort of, which means it's time to get dressed. And that is another adventure entirely. All right, breakfast is done, if we can call pottage and rock-hard bread breakfast. You've warmed your hands by the fire, wiped the crumbs off your lap, and now it's time to get dressed. But here's the thing. There's no wardrobe, no closet full of seasonal choices, no rack of tunics in different shades of beige. You have one outfit. One. And it's not because you're a minimalist or following some trendy capsule wardrobe idea. It's because that's all you own. A single long tunic made of rough wool or linen, passed down from someone older, someone dead, or maybe someone both. You've worn it every day for months, possibly years. It wasn't tailored to fit you. There are no sizes marked inside. It hangs on your body however it wants, tight in the chest, loose in the arms, awkward in all the wrong places, but it covers you. Mostly. And that's what matters. Underneath, if you're lucky, you have a linen undertunic to act as a kind of buffer between your skin and the scratchy wool. If you're not lucky, and most aren't, you go commando. That's right. No underwear, no socks, just hope and tolerance. And then come the smells, because this tunic has not been washed in weeks, maybe months. Washing clothes in the Middle Ages wasn't simple. It meant hauling heavy buckets of water from a stream or a well, heating that water over a fire, scrubbing garments by hand using ashes or lye, then drying them in the open air, assuming the weather cooperated. That entire process could take an entire day, a day you didn't have. So unless your tunic was literally crawling on its own, you wore it dirty, again and again. Let's talk color. Your clothing wasn't black, white, or bold jewel tones. No, your tunic is probably brown, or a sort of greenish-grayish mud color. Why? Because dyes were expensive. Bright fabrics were for nobles and churchmen. You, a peasant, wore colors that matched the ground you walked on. And your shoes. What shoes? If you're very fortunate, you might own a pair of leather turn shoes, thin, floppy things that barely protect your feet from rocks and cold mud. Most days you go barefoot, through puddles, over stones, across dung-covered paths. You learn to ignore the pain. And when winter comes, you wrap your feet in cloth and pray. Now imagine what that does to your skin, to your nails, to your sense of dignity. But perhaps the worst part isn't the discomfort. It's the itching, because your tunic is home not just to your body, but to an entire population of lice, fleas, and mites. These little squatters burrow into the seams, nest in the armpits, and breed freely along your neckline. They don't ask permission, they don't pay rent, and everyone has them. It doesn't matter if you're a farmer, a monk, or the village baker's daughter. Parasites are part of the package. You'll see. People scratching in church, in the fields, while talking to each other, while singing lullabies to babies. No one flinches, no one judges. It's just another day in the 1300s. Historical records mention lousy garments, literally meaning infested with lice. Some even mention people boiling their clothes to try and kill the bugs, only to wear them wet because there was no time to dry. And then there's what you don't have. No gloves. No scarves? No coats? In the summer, you overheat in the same heavy wool tunic. In the winter, you freeze in it. There's no dressing for the season. There's only dressing for survival. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's this. Comfort, in the medieval world, was a foreign concept. You didn't dress to look good. You didn't even dress to feel good. You dressed because being naked was illegal and cold, and yet people still found a way to make it meaningful. You might mend your tunic with a special stitch passed down from your grandmother. You might tie a bit of ribbon around your waist. If you were lucky enough to find one discarded at the market, you might trade for a scrap of dyed cloth and sew it into a sleeve, just for a touch of color. A reminder that you are still a person, not just a peasant. Because that's what clothes really are, a reflection of dignity, even when they itch, even when they reek, even when they barely hold together at the seams. So next time you open your closet and say, "Ugh, I have nothing to wear," remember this. Once upon a time, people literally had nothing to wear but a sack of wool and a prayer, and they still showed up to life. But there's no time to dwell. Now that you're dressed in your one and only tunic, it's time to start your real work. And that, my friend, is where the day truly begins. By now you've survived a night on a straw mattress, used a wooden bucket as a toilet, choked down a bowl of mystery gruel, and slipped into the only tunic you own. But there's something else, something that's been with you from the moment you woke up. It's not the cold, not the hunger, not even the lack of privacy. It's the itching. You scratch behind your ear, then your elbow, then your thigh. It's not just a momentary tickle. It's a full-body symphony of discomfort. And no, it's not in your head. Your body isn't just itchy, it's infested. Lice live in the seams of your clothes and burrow into your hairline. Fleas hop between the folds of your tunic, feeding on your blood and leaving tiny bites that swell and burn. Mites dig under your skin, causing rashes that spread like wildfire. And bedbugs? They've already had their breakfast, while you were still trying to remember what sleep felt like. This isn't poor hygiene. This is just life. Because in the 1300s, everyone has parasites, even monks in stone monasteries, even nobles in drafty castles, even children barely old enough to walk. There are no baths, no shampoo, no bug spray, no antibiotics. There is only you, your skin, and the constant battle between scratching and not screaming. In medieval times, people didn't bathe regularly. Many believed that washing too often opened the pores and let in disease. So, dirt wasn't just accepted, it was considered protective. And that layer of grime you've been collecting for weeks? That was your armor. Lice, meanwhile, were so common that they earned nicknames in poems and songs. Some medieval texts even mention louse combs, tiny wooden tools used not to eliminate lice, but simply to reduce their numbers to a manageable. Swarm fungus thrived too, especially on the feet, warm, damp, and constantly exposed to mud, waste, and sweat. Ringworm, scabies, and open sores were common. And without modern treatments, these conditions didn't just stay on the skin. They got worse. They spread. They festered. Imagine this. You're standing in a field, holding a wooden hoe, scratching your armpit with the handle, trying not to groan out loud. Your neighbor beside you is doing the same, only he's switched to using a stick. You exchange. A look that says, "Yeah, me too." This is community, medieval style. In a strange way, the itch becomes a shared language, a cultural norm, a low-level agony no one even talks about because everyone's living through it. And when it becomes unbearable, you try folk remedies. Maybe boil some herbs, rub vinegar into your scalp, whisper a prayer. Sometimes the scratching gets so bad that it breaks the skin. And then comes infection. You don't have antiseptic, or gauze, or doctors. If you're lucky, your neighbor knows a salve recipe. If not, you wait, and hope it doesn't spread. Historical writings are full of these little details, notes about pustules of the foot, itching sores, and boils of unknown origin. These weren't rare occurrences. They were everyday facts. So, what can we learn from this? Maybe this. We often think of comfort as optional, a bonus, something to be earned. But in the past, comfort wasn't a choice. It was a fantasy. The simple act of having skin that doesn't burn, sting, or crawl. That's luxury. The freedom to take a shower whenever you want, to sleep on clean sheets, to put on clothes that don't bite you back. That's not normal. That's extraordinary. So the next time you feel the urge to complain about an itchy sweater or a mosquito bite, think of your medieval self. Think of the endless scratching, the raw skin, the shame of pulling a louse out of your collar while talking to a priest, and then smile. Because you've come a long, long way, but don't get too relaxed. You've endured the scratchy tunic, the buzzing lice, the bucket of shame, and the flavorless breakfast stew. You step outside, finally ready to face the day. And then, as you yawn, a sharp pain shoots through your jaw. It's your tooth, again. You press your tongue against it, hoping it's just a fluke. Maybe a bit of grit stuck between your molars. But no, that dull, pulsing ache has returned. That familiar throb, the one that starts behind the gums and spreads like a drumbeat through your entire skull. You already know what's coming. And there's nothing you can do, because in medieval Europe, if your tooth hurts, you wait. You wait for it to rot. You wait for it to loosen. You wait for it to fall out on its own. And until it does, you just live with it. There's no toothbrush in your hut, no floss. No dentist with a gentle smile and a sterile tray of tools. At best, you might chew on a frayed stick dipped in ashes or vinegar. Some folks rub their teeth with cloth. Others rinse with wine or salt water. But daily brushing, oral hygiene, that's not part of your world. The result? Decay is everywhere. By the time you reach your 20s, your teeth are stained, chipped, and riddled with cavities. Gums are swollen. Breath is sour. You try not to chew on one side because that one molar hasn't been right since the last harvest. And here's the worst part. When it becomes unbearable, when the pain spreads to your ear, when the jaw swells, when you can't sleep for nights on end, there's only one person who can help. The barber. Yes, the same man who trims your hair with a dull blade, who might bleed your arm to balance your humors, is also the local dentist. You sit in his wooden chair, clutching the arms, while he approaches with iron tongs that haven't seen soap, let alone sterilization, since they were forged. There's no numbing agent, no anesthesia, just a leather strap to bite, and the distant hope that you'll faint before he starts pulling. The tooth cracks. It doesn't come out whole. There's more tugging, more cracking, sometimes screaming, sometimes infection, sometimes death. Because in a world without antibiotics, a simple tooth abscess can turn into sepsis. The swelling spreads. Fever takes hold. You shiver in your straw bed, whispering prayers to saints you barely remember the names of, and hope it passes. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. And yet, people keep going. They eat coarse bread that grinds down their enamel. They sip beer to dull the ache. They press cold cloths to their faces and mumble through swollen cheeks. You might think kissing would be a comfort, a small joy. But think again. With rotting teeth and chronic halitosis, intimacy is rare. Smiles are cautious. Courtship is practical. You're not chosen for your looks, but for your land, your labor, your livestock. So yes, you marry. But not because your grin lights up a room. And still, people laugh. They joke about the missing teeth. They share stories of the time Maud lost her front one biting into last year's turnip. They pass down remedies, clove oil, sage compresses, cold iron under the tongue. They adapt, because that's what humans do. We adapt, even in pain, and maybe that's the quiet lesson here. We often take our mouths for granted. We speak, we smile, we bite into apples, we sip cold water without pain. But in the medieval world, every bite was a risk. Every tooth was a gamble. And every visit to the barber was a test of faith, courage, and a high tolerance for bad tools. So tonight, when you brush your teeth, fluoride toothpaste, clean water, soft bristles, pause for a moment. That's not a routine. That's a miracle, because somewhere, long ago, a version of you sat in a wooden chair, blood in their mouth, holding a cracked tooth in their hand, and whispered, "Never again." And thanks to them, never again. Now, take a deep breath. Grit your remaining teeth. Because the ache won't stop you. It's time to work. And in medieval Europe, work means exactly what it sounds like. Backbreaking, unrelenting labor. Just to stay alive. Let's head to the fields. By now, you're awake. Dressed in scratchy wool, full of weak beer and lukewarm pottage, and your tooth still throbs from yesterday's agony. But none of that matters. Because the sun is rising, and that means it's time to work. There's no negotiation, no choice. No, maybe I'll sleep in just this once. You work. Because if you don't eat. And if you don't eat, you don't live. Welcome to your office. Except instead of a desk, it's a field. Instead of a chair, it's a patch of cold, uneven ground. Instead of a laptop, you have a wooden hoe, a rusted sickle, and a back that already aches before you even begin. If you're a peasant in 14th century Europe, your job is simple. Survive by laboring from sunrise to sunset. 6 days a week, every week. The only day off is Sunday, and even that can be interrupted by harvests, sickness, or sudden raids. And this isn't the kind of hard work we talk about today. This is relentless, physical, soul-numbing toil. You bend, you lift, you dig, you plant seeds by hand, one by one. You pull weeds with raw fingers. You carry buckets of water across uneven terrain. You do all of it with no shoes, no gloves, and no breaks, except to scratch your lice or wipe sweat from your brow. Even if your body is sore, even if your hands are blistered and cracked, you keep going. Because stopping isn't an option, and no one says thank you. Because this isn't a passion, this isn't a calling, this is survival, and you're not working for yourself, not really. The land doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the Lord. Everything. You grow, wheat, barley, onions, beans, is divided up. A portion goes to him, a portion to the church. You keep what's left, if there's anything left at all, and if there's a bad harvest, a flood, a plague of insects, too bad, you still owe your share. Historical records show that peasants were often taxed in grain, chickens, eggs, even hours of labor. Sometimes you had to fix roads or dig ditches for your lord instead of your own family. Your time is not your own, and neither is your body. Let's say you're a woman. In addition to field work, you're raising children, cooking meals, spinning wool, mending clothes, and tending to livestock. If your husband falls ill, you work twice as hard. If a baby is crying, you tie them to your back and keep digging. If you're pregnant, you keep going until you can't. Even children work. By the time they're 5 or 6, they're herding goats, fetching water, or chasing birds away from crops. There's no school, no toys, just chores and fatigue. And the weather, it's never on your side. In summer, the heat is blistering. Your tunic soaks through in sweat, clinging to your back. There's no shade, no hat, no sunblock. You keep going. In winter, your fingers go numb. Your breath fogs in front of you. The soil is hard as stone, and yet you work, because the field doesn't wait. It doesn't care how tired you are. It doesn't care that your back feels like it might snap in half. It demands, and you obey. So, why keep going? Why didn't people just give up? Because they couldn't. Because even in the harshest conditions, people clung to the hope that the next season might be better, that the next harvest might be fuller, that their children might one day eat without counting every crust, and they found tiny joys where they could. A warm fire after a wet day, a song shared in the field, a smile from someone who understands your pain without needing to speak. These weren't just workers, they were fighters, and maybe that's the lesson we carry with us. Today, many of us complain about being exhausted after a long Zoom call, but exhaustion in the medieval world meant something entirely different. It meant physical collapse. It meant skin rubbed raw, joints worn down, fingers permanently curved from gripping tools. So if you're reading this with a roof over your head, a soft chair beneath you, and no blisters on your palms, take a second to be grateful. You are someone's wildest dream, but the day isn't over yet, because after hours of bending and sweating and digging, the sun is still high, and the weather has plans of its own. Let's talk about that next. It's noon now, and the sun is directly above you. You pause, wipe your brow with a sleeve that's already soaked through, and look up. Big mistake. The sun glares back like a judgment. There's no mercy in that sky, just heat, relentless and blinding. And the worst part, there's nowhere to hide. In the Middle Ages, weather isn't just part of the background. It's a main character in your life. A moody, unforgiving force that shapes everything you do. You live at its mercy. In winter, you freeze. In summer, you burn. In spring, you get soaked. And in autumn, you pray the crops survive the storms. Let's start with the cold. Your home has no insulation. The wind slips through cracks in the wooden walls like an uninvited guest. Your feet are always cold, sometimes damp, sometimes numb. The fire in your hearth is small, barely enough to warm your hands, let alone the entire room. You wear the same tunic year-round. No layering, no fleece, just wool. Damp, itchy, stubborn wool. Night, frost creeps across the inside of the walls. You curl up under your blanket, thick with filth and bugs, and wonder if your toes will still be there in the morning. Frostbite isn't diagnosed, it's just bad luck. And when you wake, your joints are stiff, your breath visible, and your bones ache as if they've aged 50 years overnight. Now jump forward to summer. Warmth. Finally, relief from the cold. Right? Wrong. The heat is suffocating. Your hut turns into a clay oven. The air inside is thick, unmoving. You sweat through your clothes, but you can't take them off. Modesty matters, even if it's 100 degrees, and you're about to faint. There are no fans, no breeze, no deodorant, no showers. You itch more, you stink more. You're so hot that the thought of food makes your stomach turn. And still, you have to work. In the fields, the sun bakes the soil into stone. Your tools are hot to the touch. Your mouth is dry. The only water nearby is from a well or a river, both teeming with bacteria you can't see, but your stomach knows all too well. And then come the bugs. Flies buzz around your face. Mosquitoes feast on your skin. Gnats swarm your eyes. They're drawn to the sweat, to the filth, to the livestock, and to you. Sometimes it's so bad you tie a piece of cloth over your nose and mouth just to breathe. But the cloth is hot, heavy, and soon soaked with sweat. There's no relief. Rain? It doesn't help either. Your thatched roof leaks. The floor turns to mud. Your bedding smells even worse. And the wood you need to start a fire is too wet to burn, and if there's too much rain, the crops drown. Too little, they wither. In the 14th century, entire villages were wiped out by bad weather. Famines followed floods. Droughts followed storms. People watched their fields die and knew they might be next. There's no weather app to prepare you. There's just the sky, the wind, and your gut instinct. Even noblemen weren't safe. Their stone castles were cold and damp, drafty and uncomfortable. Their fires roared bigger, sure, but the walls still froze in winter, and the stone still sweated in summer. The rich might wear fur, but they couldn't stop the mold creeping through their halls, or the rats nesting by the fireplace. And here's the truth. No matter how hard you worked, how carefully you planned, how faithfully you prayed, weather could undo it all in a single night. A flood could wash away your home. A frost could kill your seedlings. A storm could blow the roof off your hut. There was no escape. So how did people endure? They adapted. They read the skies like scripture. They passed down weather lore in stories. Red sky at morning, shepherd take warning. They planted in faith and harvested in fear. They built community around survival, helping neighbors, sharing food, taking in those whose homes had been destroyed. And when they gathered around the fire at night, cold, hungry, dirty, they didn't talk about dreams of comfort. They talked about tomorrow, about trying again, about holding on, one season at a time. Because life wasn't about avoiding hardship. It was about weathering it together, and maybe that's the lesson. Today we complain when the AC breaks, when it rains on a vacation, when it's too windy for a walk. But in the Middle Ages, weather wasn't inconvenient. It was everything. So the next time you step out into the cold, or the heat, or the rain, don't curse it. Feel it. Remember what it meant to live without shelter, without control, without safety, and then head back inside. And be grateful. But for now, you stay outside, because despite the weather, despite the pain, despite the fatigue, you still have work to do. The sun is setting. Your back is sore. Your hands are cracked. You've been in the field since morning, and your entire body feels like it's been borrowed from someone older, someone much older. You make your way back to your hut, boots caked in mud, skin stiff with dried sweat and dust. And there, in the dim glow of the hearth, you're greeted by the one thing that might just bring you comfort. Dinner. Except, this isn't comfort food. It's survival food, and survival doesn't taste good. You sit down, cross-legged, on the hard floor next to your family. Maybe 6 or 7 of you, sharing one bowl and one wooden spoon that's seen better centuries. The fire crackles softly, casting shadows on the walls, as someone ladles out what's left of the pottage. Yes, that pottage, the same one you had for breakfast, and yesterday, and last week. It's a thick stew of boiled roots, wilted greens, and mystery bits, some too soft to recognize, others too hard to chew. And then comes the bread. Hard, dark, dense. It's not sliced. It's broken, chiseled, negotiated. It's made from coarse flour, rye or barley if you're lucky. In lean seasons, the flour is stretched with things like powdered bark, ground up acorns, or even sawdust. Yes, sawdust. It doesn't add flavor, but it keeps you full, sort of. Sometimes there's a gray-green fuzz on the crust, mold. But you eat it anyway, because throwing it away is unthinkable. Food doesn't go to waste, not when the next harvest is still months away. And that mold? It's not just unappetizing, it's dangerous. Some of it, like ergot, contains natural toxins that cause convulsions, hallucinations, or even death. There are records of entire villages struck by outbreaks, people dancing uncontrollably in the streets, foaming at the mouth, or dying in their sleep after eating the wrong slice of rye. And yet, dinner must go on. There might be a bit of cheese, if. You have a goat, but it's sharp, sour, and smells stronger than the stable. Still, it's protein. And protein is rare. Meat? Not unless it's Sunday or a feast day. Even then, it's mostly offal. Organ meats, bones boiled for broth, scraps you chew on until your jaw aches. What about vegetables? Only the ones in season. Turnips, leeks, onions. Sometimes pickled, sometimes dried. Always plain. Fruit? Only in summer. And even then, if it isn't eaten fast, it ferments. More than one child has fallen asleep, giggling after biting into a half-rotted plum that turned into nature's wine. And drinks? No water. It's too dangerous. So once again, you reach for the small beer. The one that's weak enough for kids to drink but strong enough to kill some of the microbes in your gut. It doesn't taste great, but it's better than dysentery, and so you eat. You chew slowly, quietly, not because it's delicious, but because this might be all there is until tomorrow, and yet, somehow, this moment feels sacred. You're together, you're warm, the fire is still burning, and the food, no matter how bland or risky, is shared. In many ways, dinner is the heart of the medieval day, not because it nourishes the body, but because it anchors the spirit. It's the pause, the gathering, the reminder that even in a life full of toil, there is still time for something resembling comfort. It might be a joke shared between bites, or a lullaby hummed softly to a tired child, or a prayer whispered not out of fear but gratitude, because yes, the bread might be hard and the stew might be sour, but you're still here, you're still eating, and that means something. So what can we learn from this? That nourishment isn't always about flavor. Sometimes it's about ritual, about presence, about resilience. Today we complain when our food is cold, when it's bland, when the delivery is late. But centuries ago, dinner was a gamble. Every bite was a risk. Every meal was a small miracle. So the next time you sit down with a warm plate in front of you, take one moment to appreciate what it means. Not just the ingredients, but the ease, the safety, the privilege of not having to wonder whether your next meal might make you sick or save your life. And with your belly now half full and your limbs heavy from the day, it's time to wind down. The sun is gone, the fire is low, and sleep, such as it is calling. Let's head to bed. The fire has burned down to a few stubborn coals. You sit on the floor, rubbing your hands together, letting the last of the warmth soak into your skin. Outside, the wind sighs against the wooden walls. Somewhere in the dark, a dog barks. Or maybe it's a wolf. Your body is begging for rest. But rest, in the Middle Ages, isn't guaranteed. You don't have a bed. You have a straw mattress on. The floor, flat, uneven, and filled with more insects than comfort. The straw has been used for months, maybe longer. It smells like damp earth, smoke and sweat. Sometimes it smells like worse. You lie down beside your family. No privacy, no pillows, no personal space. If you're lucky, there's a wool blanket, heavy, itchy, and stiff from months of use. If you're not lucky, there's nothing. Just your tunic, your skin, and the chill that creeps in through the cracks in the wall. Sleep doesn't come easily. The floor is cold. Your back aches from hours of bending. Your stomach is full of questionable pottage and half-molded bread. And then there's the scratching. Always the scratching. Fleas. Lice, mites, bedbugs. They come alive at night, feasting, crawling, burrowing. You turn, trying to find a comfortable position. But your neighbor's elbow is in your ribs. Someone's foot is pressing into your leg. The baby is whimpering. Your father is snoring. The goat in the corner shifts in its sleep, and the smell of manure wafts through the room. This is sleep. This is night. And then, just when you start to drift, a sound jolts you awake, a creak, a whisper of movement. Is it the wind? Or something worse? In medieval Europe, night is not just dark. It is dangerous. There are no streetlights, no patrols, no secure locks. Your home is made of wood and thatch, easy to break into, impossible to truly secure. Robbers roam the countryside. Stray. Dogs hunt for scraps, and sometimes soldiers come through towns without warning. There's also disease, silent, invisible, creeping in with the cold air. A cough from across the room, a fever that won't break, a child who doesn't wake up. You don't know what's wrong, you don't have medicine. You just watch, and wait, and pray. Because prayer is the only comfort left. Before sleep, if you're religious, and most people are, you whisper a few words to the saints. You ask for protection. You ask for mercy. You ask to wake up tomorrow. That's never a given. Night in the Middle Ages is a test of faith as much as fatigue. And yet, somehow, sleep still comes. Not deeply, not peacefully, but just enough. You drift, and in that drifting, you dream. You might dream of a better meal, of clean water, of waking up without pain, of land that belongs to you, of a world where your children, our free dreams, even in the darkest centuries, still find a way in. And that's perhaps the most beautiful part, because when all is stripped away, comfort, health, security, hope remains. Hope is the fire that doesn't go out, even when the coals turn cold. It's what gets you up in the morning, even when your bones protest. It's what makes you plant seeds, even when last year's harvest failed. And hope isn't just a feeling. It's a choice. A decision to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. And it's a choice that people have made, quietly, stubbornly, for thousands of years, including one young girl, far away from the mud and straw of a peasant hut. A cold palace in the forests of Prussia. A girl named Sophie also lay awake at night, dreaming of something better, not food. Not warmth, but purpose, a life beyond the narrow path laid out for her. A future not defined by others, but by herself. That girl would grow into a woman who defied empires, rewrote history, and ruled with both iron and intellect. You may know her as Catherine the Great. But before she was an empress, she was just a girl, alone, waiting, hoping. So as one medieval day ends, another journey is just beginning. Let's follow it. It begins, not with a crown, but with silence. A girl lies awake in a cold stone room. The walls are tall, the windows narrow, and the air smells of damp wool and candle smoke. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters, whispering promises of a world far beyond this frozen palace. Her name is Sophie. She's just 14. And right now, she's nobody. No throne, no power, no choices of her own. Just a noble-born girl from a forgotten duchy in Prussia, trained to curtsy, to speak softly, and to obey. But Sophie is not like the other girls. While others dream of dresses and dances, she dreams of maps, of books, of the names of queens carved into history, and deep down, beneath the layers of frost and formality, something fierce begins to burn. A question. What if I was meant for more? What if a girl with no power could rise to rule the largest empire? On Earth? What if the pawn became the queen? Tonight, we begin the story of that girl. The one who crossed borders, burned bridges, outwitted kings, and rewrote her future with nothing but her mind, her courage, and her will. This is the journey of Catherine the Great, before she was great. Before she was even Catherine, because every legend starts with someone ordinary who refused to stay that way. Before the jewels, before the empire, before the name Catherine the Great echoed through history, there was Sophie Frederica Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst, not a name history books often begin with. But that's where her story starts, in a quiet duchy tucked away in the cold forests of Prussia, far from the glittering courts of Europe. She was born in 1729, not into power, not into wealth, but into what you might call well-decorated obscurity. Her father was a Prussian officer, disciplined, distant, loyal to the crown. Her mother, Johanna, was more ambitious, but not exactly affectionate. She saw her daughter less as a child and more as potential. A pawn to be played well in the political chess game of royal marriages. From the beginning, Sophie learned to live between expectations. She was taught to be polite, to stand straight, to never speak unless spoken to. But behind her quiet blue eyes, there was already movement, curiosity, hunger, observation. She listened when adults thought she wasn't. She remembered things others forgot. And while the world saw a mild-mannered girl in ribbons and lace, Sophie was building something stronger than an image. She was building a mind. Books became her sanctuary. She read everything she could: history, philosophy, theology. She studied languages. She studied people. While other girls practiced embroidery, Sophie practiced restraint. Not because she was meek, but because she understood early what many rulers never learn. Patience is a weapon. In the shadows of small rooms, she learned to walk quietly, to think carefully, to adapt, and perhaps most importantly, she learned to dream big without saying a word. No one looked at Sophie and thought, Empress, but Sophie did. And then, fate opened a door. Far away in Russia, Empress Elizabeth was searching for a bride for her nephew, the future Tsar Peter. She didn't want someone from a major European power, too much political baggage. She wanted someone minor, malleable, foreign enough to be grateful, but noble enough to fit the role. Sophie fit the bill perfectly. She was just 14 when the summons arrived. Her mother, thrilled at the opportunity, rushed her to the court. But Sophie, she knew something her mother didn't. She wasn't going to Russia to marry a prince. She was going to Russia to change her life. Let's stop here for a moment and think about that. Imagine being 14 years old. You're sent to a land whose language you don't speak, whose customs you don't know, to marry a man you've never met, all to satisfy someone else's ambition. Most people would be terrified. Sophie was prepared, because long before the crown ever touched her head, she had already made the most powerful decision of her life. She chose not to be a pawn. She chose to become a player. And that's the first lesson we take from her story. Where you begin doesn't define you. You don't need to be born in a palace to shape the world. You don't need applause to practice greatness. You just need awareness, resilience, and the courage to say yes to the doors no one else notices. Sophie didn't demand power. She positioned herself for it. And that quiet positioning, the reading, the discipline, the observation, would soon become the foundation of a reign that reshaped a nation. So she packed her things, left everything familiar behind, and traveled east toward a land of snow, suspicion, and staggering opportunity. She arrived in Russia in 1744. A teenager with thin shoes, a thick accent, and a diplomatic smile. She didn't yet speak Russian, but she would. She hadn't yet converted to orthodoxy, but she would. She hadn't yet met her husband-to-be, Peter. But soon, she would meet the man who would test every ounce of her patience and set the stage for her rise. Because next comes the transformation. Sophie must leave herself behind and become someone new. The carriage wheels creaked and cracked over the frozen roads. Outside, snow blanketed everything in silence. Sophie, now 15, pressed her gloved fingers to the glass, staring out at a country that felt more myth than real. Russia. It was colder than she'd imagined. Not just in weather, but in welcome. When? She arrived in St. Petersburg. There was no parade, no soft introductions. The Russian court was dazzling, yes, but also frigid, calculating, and steeped in centuries of traditions Sophie did not yet understand. The ceilings were too high, the eyes too sharp, the halls too silent. But Sophie, she was watching, as always. She may have arrived with nothing more than charm, but she intended to leave her mark on every room she entered. Her first challenge was the language. Russian is no gentle tongue, thick with consonants, rolled with force. But Sophie attacked it like a soldier with a sword. She practiced day and night, repeating phrases until her throat was sore. She whispered prayers in Russian before she fully understood what they meant. She wasn't just trying to speak the language. She was trying to belong. She also studied Russian history, customs, the rituals of the Orthodox Church. She visited chapels, memorized etiquette, read Russian folk tales. Every gesture, every phrase, every nod, she practiced it all until it became second nature. It wasn't performative. It was survival. And eventually it became something more, something real. When the Empress Elizabeth finally met her, she was charmed. Here was a girl who wanted to become Russian, who had crossed countries not to be royalty, but to earn it. Still, charm alone wasn't enough. There were eyes on her, many of them suspicious. At court, every step was watched, every whisper weighed. She wasn't just a future bride, she was a foreigner. And in the Russian court, foreigners were often tolerated, but rarely trusted. She was told she wasn't pretty enough, too thin, too plain, too serious. Sophie didn't argue. She smiled and kept learning. Because while others used beauty, titles, or family name to rise, Sophie relied on adaptation. And in a place like the Russian palace, where beauty faded fast and alliances shifted like shadows, adaptation was the only thing that lasted. There's a famous story that captures this moment in her life. One day, she fell dangerously ill, raging fever, violent chills. Doctors feared she might not survive, but Sophie refused to show weakness. Despite her condition, she insisted on dragging herself from her bed and standing upright before Empress Elizabeth, swearing that she would recover, and that she would. Serve Russia with every breath she had. The Empress, deeply moved, wept, and Sophie, she survived. But she didn't just survive. She earned a new name, Ekaterina Alexeyevna, Catherine. It was more than a religious conversion. It was a rebirth. She had given up her old identity, her homeland, her religion, even her mother tongue, all, to become part of something bigger. And now, she wasn't just in Russia, she was Russia. It's hard to overstate what that meant, because Catherine wasn't guaranteed anything. She wasn't a blood heir. She wasn't adored by the nobles. She had no army, no riches of her own, just her mind, her charm, and an unshakable resolve. She was still just a teenager, still not married, still without power. But in this new land of ice and opulence, Catherine had taken her first step toward the throne, not by grabbing it, but by blending in so seamlessly that people stopped seeing the seams. And maybe that's the lesson here. True reinvention doesn't come from pretending. It comes from becoming. Catherine didn't fake her loyalty to Russia. She built it, brick by brick, prayer by prayer, word by word, until it was real. And in doing so, she discovered something even greater. That power isn't always taken with force. Sometimes it begins with quiet consistency. A girl in a foreign land standing tall in a borrowed name, in a borrowed dress, with borrowed faith, but unshakable belief in herself. That belief would carry her forward. But there was still one test she hadn't passed. Marriage, because the boy she was betrothed to, the future Tsar, wasn't exactly what fairy tales had promised. He was awkward, childish, unfit, and Catherine would have to decide, survive him or outgrow him. Catherine had changed her name. She had changed her faith. She had studied the language, the rituals, and the politics of a new empire, but nothing could prepare her for Peter. Peter, the heir to the Russian throne, was everything Catherine was not. Where she was thoughtful, Peter was impulsive. Where she read books, he played with toy soldiers. Where she carried herself with poise, Peter stumbled, socially, emotionally, and often physically. He was the nephew of the current Empress, Elizabeth, and the chosen heir. But Peter was a troubled man-child. Raised in the rigid courts of Holstein, isolated from his peers and emotionally neglected, he entered adulthood stunted and bitter. Catherine, barely 16, was expected to marry him. And she did. Not out of love, not out of choice, but because that was her path to survival, and possibly one day power. The wedding was grand. Fireworks lit the sky, choirs sang, and the court celebrated. But behind the scenes, Catherine's heart sank. On their wedding night, Peter barely acknowledged her. He was uninterested, awkward, cold, and for years, yes, years, he refused to consummate the marriage. Some say he was physically incapable. Others say he simply didn't care. Meanwhile, Catherine lived under the constant pressure to produce an heir. The Empress, Elizabeth, watched her like a hawk. The court gossiped. Whispers swirled. Why no child? Was Catherine barren? Was she at fault? All while Catherine suffered in silence beside a man who mocked her, ignored her, and, at times, humiliated her publicly. Peter adored all things Prussian, Frederick the Great, German uniforms, military drills in the courtyard. He had no love for Russia and made little effort to hide it. He sneered at Orthodox traditions, insulted the Russian nobility, and often acted like a child in a man's world. And Catherine? She endured, because she knew something most people didn't. You can't fight a storm with fists. You ride it, quietly, patiently, and wait for the moment it breaks. She continued to study. She built relationships in court, particularly among military leaders and scholars. She remained respectful in public, dutiful in private. But behind closed doors, she began writing journals, letters, and ideas for reform. Thoughts on governance, law, and justice. She wasn't just surviving a toxic marriage. She was preparing for something greater. And then there was the danger. Peter's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He drank heavily. He insulted Catherine in front of guests. He joked about replacing her. He even threatened to take a mistress as his official wife. And Catherine? Still, she said nothing. But she remembered everything. She also began to gather quiet support. Officers in the military, courtiers tired of Peter's games, advisors who saw her intelligence and saw in her a better future for Russia. It's worth noting, Catherine did eventually have a son, Paul. Historians still debate whether Peter was the father. Some suspect Gregory Orlov, one of Catherine's Tsar's early allies and lovers. But in the eyes of the court, it didn't matter. A male heir had been born. Catherine had fulfilled her duty, and that gave her just enough breathing room to think bigger. Let's pause here for a moment. Can you imagine what it feels like to be married to someone who belittles you daily, to walk on eggshells every hour, to be watched by an entire empire and yet feel completely alone? Catherine didn't escape that marriage by running. She didn't win by fighting. She endured. She planned. She played the long game. And that's the lesson here. Sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes power isn't in what you say, but what you don't. Catherine waited, through years of silence, of insult, of invisibility, because she understood something powerful. Storms pass, but those who prepare rise. And rise she would, because soon Peter would become emperor. And that was when everything would begin to change. At court, people often mistook Catherine's silence for submission. They saw a quiet woman standing beside an unpredictable husband, keeping her head down, hands folded. She never interrupted. She rarely objected. She listened. She smiled. And they assumed that meant she wasn't paying attention. They were wrong. Catherine wasn't passive. She was gathering every smirk, every insult, every shift in loyalty, every careless word spilled over wine goblets at state dinners. She absorbed it all, because Catherine understood something powerful early on. Not all queens take power by storm. Some take it by watching. While Peter played at war in the courtyard with wooden soldiers, Catherine was building a mental map of the empire, one person at a time. She memorized who supported whom, who owed favors, who was frustrated, who was scared. She watched how the Empress, Elizabeth, ruled, what made her admired and what made her feared. She paid attention to how people moved when Elizabeth entered a room and what they whispered when she left. She studied the church, its language, its authority, its blind spots. And most importantly, she listened to the people no one else heard. The guards, the maids, the wives of mid-ranking officers, the tutors, the secretaries. She heard the gossip before it became policy, the rumors before they turned into rebellion. And through it all, she said very little, because Catherine knew that silence is not weakness. Silence is a mirror. It reflects everything around it, and it gives nothing away. While Peter mocked the Orthodox clergy and threatened nobles with nonsense reforms, Catherine quietly visited monasteries. She showed respect. She learned the rituals. She spoke with bishops, not to control them, but to understand them. She didn't try to force herself into the Russian soul. She studied it, until she could speak its language better than those born to it. And in doing so, she created something rare, genuine loyalty. When the time came, those people remembered how she had treated them, not with royal arrogance, but with attentiveness. Let's stop here for a moment and reflect on this idea. Power doesn't always come from speaking. Sometimes it comes from hearing what no one else does. In a court full of noise, Peter's tantrums, ministers' speeches, nobles' schemes, Catherine found her advantage in observation. She took what others saw as waiting and turned it into preparation. This wasn't about being sneaky, it was about being ready. Because Catherine knew her moment would come, not by chance, but by design, and she would need to know exactly where to step when it did. History often celebrates the loudest voices, but Catherine's story reminds us that clarity, not volume, is the root of leadership. She journaled daily. She read Enlightenment thinkers, Montesquieu, Voltaire, often in secret. She wrote long reflections on justice, law, and governance, imagining what a better Russia might look like, not just for nobles, but for everyone. And all the while, she never challenged Peter publicly. Not yet. Because power gained through force can be lost just as fast. But power built through strategy, that's harder to undo. And so Catherine waited, as she always had, patiently, quietly, observing, preparing. Until one day, her husband made the mistake of handing her an opening. In 1762, Empress Elizabeth died. Peter became emperor. And from the very beginning, he began to fall apart. It happened in the early hours of a July morning, 1762. The air in St. Petersburg was thick with tension, the kind that hums just beneath the surface, too quiet to hear, but impossible to ignore. The streets were still, the guards at their posts, the city unaware that history was about to turn on its head. Catherine didn't wear armor. She didn't raise a sword. She didn't need to. She had already done the hard work, years of quiet listening, steady alliance building, and relentless patience. Now, it was time to act. Let's rewind for just a moment. Peter III, Catherine's husband, had only been emperor for 6 months. In that short span, he'd insulted the Russian Orthodox Church, dismissed loyal officers, reversed popular policies, and openly praised Frederick the Great, Russia's enemy in the recent war. Even worse, he had spoken of divorcing Catherine. She heard the rumors, she saw his recklessness, and she realized if she didn't move soon, he would. But instead of panic, Catherine chose precision. She reached out to the Orloff brothers, powerful military men, deeply loyal to her, especially Gregory, one of her closest confidants and rumored lover. Through them, she quietly gained the support of key army regiments, particularly the elite Imperial Guard. She didn't raise an army, she earned one. And then, when Peter was away at his summer residence, Catherine made her move. She rode to the barracks in full regalia. Cloaked in confidence, she stood before the soldiers and declared herself not just their empress, but the protector of Russia itself. They didn't hesitate. They shouted their loyalty. They kissed her hand. They followed her through the streets, chanting her name. It wasn't a war. It was a wave of support that surged across the capital before Peter could even pack a bag. By the time he received word of the uprising, it was already over. He tried to flee. He begged. He offered to share the throne. But it was too late. He was arrested. Just days later, he was dead. The official report said hemorrhoidal colic. No one believed it, but no one challenged it either, because the truth was clear. Catherine was now empress, not by blood, not by inheritance, but by sheer force of will, strategy, and the quiet loyalty she had cultivated for years, and not a single shot had to be fired. It was one of the cleanest coups in Russian history, and perhaps the most audacious. A woman, foreign-born, once powerless, had taken the throne of the largest empire on earth, without bloodshed. So how did she do it? Not with anger, not with vengeance, but with vision. She saw what Peter never could, that ruling isn't about title, it's about trust. She had earned the trust of the army, the church, the people, and that trust became her crown. Let's sit with that for a second. How often do we believe that power has to be loud? That to lead, you have to dominate? Catherine's coup reminds us. Power doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like focus. She didn't scream. She didn't storm the palace. She simply stepped into the space Peter left behind. Because when you prepare with purpose, when you lead with clarity, and when people believe in you, sometimes all you have to do is stand up. And the world will rise with you. Her coronation came soon after. She was crowned Empress of all Russia, Catherine II. But she knew taking the throne was only the beginning. Now she had to keep it, and to do that, she had to transform her coup into a legacy. Power in hand, crown on her head, Catherine could have stopped. She had done the unthinkable, taken the Russian throne without a single battle. She could have ruled in comfort, protected by loyal guards and gilded walls, but that was never enough for her. Because Catherine didn't just want to sit on the throne, she wanted to reshape it. From the very start of her reign, she asked a dangerous question. Could a monarch be both powerful and enlightened? It was a bold thought, especially in 18th century Russia, a land steeped in tradition, ruled by fear, and tethered to a rigid class system where serfs labored endlessly beneath privileged nobles. But Catherine had been reading. Even before she seized power, she had devoured the writings of Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Diderot, philosophers who spoke of reason, liberty, and the idea that a ruler's duty was to serve the people, not simply reign over them. It inspired her. It challenged her. And so, Catherine began her reign not with swords, but with paper. In 1767, she assembled what was called the Legislative Commission, a massive gathering of delegates from all walks of Russian life, nobles, townspeople, even Cossacks and non-Russian ethnic groups. Their mission? to help rewrite the nation's outdated and chaotic legal code. Catherine herself drafted a remarkable document to guide them, the Nakaz. It called for laws based on reason. It denounced torture. It proposed equality under the law. She wrote, with passion and clarity, that the purpose of government was not to glorify the sovereign, but to protect the lives and property of its citizens. And for a moment, it looked like a new Russia was being born. But then, reality set in. The nobles resisted. The clergy whispered. The serfs were never truly given a voice. And before long, the commission unraveled, not because Catherine lacked vision, but because the country she inherited wasn't ready for it. Still, she didn't give up. She turned her attention to education, founding schools for girls, funding the first state-run system of primary education, and expanding access to libraries. She supported the arts and sciences, growing Russia's cultural landscape to rival Western Europe. She even bought the personal library of the philosopher Diderot, funding his work and welcoming his ideas, while firmly keeping the reins of power in her own hands. Because here's the twist. As much as Catherine admired Enlightenment ideals, she never loosened her grip on the throne. She was a reformer, but on her terms. She talked of justice, but kept the nobles close. And when a massive peasant rebellion rose up in 1773, led by a man named Yemelyan Pugachev, who claimed to be Catherine's dead husband, she responded not with dialogue, but with force. The rebellion was crushed. Thousands were killed. And Catherine, shaken, began to pull back from her earlier ideals. She strengthened the power of the nobility. She extended serfdom deeper into the empire. She tightened censorship to protect order. So was she a hypocrite, a fraud? Not quite. Because Catherine was trying to do something nearly impossible, to bring modern ideas to a medieval country, to rule a land still crawling through feudalism while dreaming of enlightenment. She was a woman, raised in royal obedience, shaped by revolution, and forged in realpolitik. She knew that idealism without control would collapse into chaos, but control without vision was just tyranny. So she balanced, constantly, carefully. She was both empress and editor, dictator and dreamer. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Progress doesn't always come wrapped in perfection. Sometimes it shows up wearing a crown, with ink-stained fingers, and a sword tucked quietly behind a velvet robe. Catherine didn't free the serfs. She didn't establish democracy, but she cracked open the doors to reason. She let new air into an empire suffocating under centuries of stagnation. And she dared to ask what a woman, not born Russian, not born royal, could do with absolute power. Her contradictions were many, but her ambition was clear. She wasn't trying to be perfect. She was trying to be effective. And as her empire grew, so did her vision. Because now, Catherine didn't just want to change Russia from the inside. She wanted to reshape the world around her. Catherine never fancied herself a conqueror. She preferred pens over sabers, letters over battle cries, enlightenment over empire. But power has a rhythm of its own. And soon, Catherine found herself not just shaping laws and schools, but redrawing the borders of the world. When she took the throne, Russia was already vast, but it was fractured, hemmed in by empires to the west and blocked to the south by the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, Russia had longed for something it had never quite secured, a warm water port, a gateway to the world. And Catherine, she saw more than geography. She saw opportunity. Her first major campaign came in the 1760s against the Ottoman Turks. It was a gamble. The Ottomans were powerful, fierce, and deeply entrenched in the Black Sea region. But Catherine had something they didn't: leadership. She relied on brilliant military minds like General Alexander Suvorov and her trusted confidant, and perhaps lover, Grigory Potemkin. Under their command, the Russian army swept south with discipline and clarity, capturing key territories and ultimately securing Crimea. It was more than a military win. It was a message. Russia was no longer an isolated northern giant. It had arrived at the Black Sea. It had access to the Mediterranean, and it had just signaled to the world, "We're here to stay." Catherine commemorated the victory not with parades, but with infrastructure. She ordered the construction of new cities: Odessa, Kherson, Sevastopol. These weren't just outposts. They were symbols of Russian permanence, planted firmly in what had once been enemy soil. But even as soldiers moved borders with boots and blades, Catherine worked another front: diplomacy. She played empires against each other with subtlety and precision. One of her most controversial moves was her role in the partitions of Poland. Poland at the time was weak, fractured by internal conflict, and vulnerable to outside influence. Catherine, along with Austria and Prussia, orchestrated a slow-motion dissection of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. By the Third Partition in 1795, Poland was gone, wiped off the map. It was brutal, ruthless, strategically brilliant. Russia walked away with massive new territory and millions of new subjects. And while some condemned the move as imperial overreach, Catherine framed it as restoration, bringing order where there had been chaos. To many in her court, she had proven something few women in power ever had. She could win, and she could expand. But her conquests were never just military. Catherine believed in civilizing the new territories, according to her own enlightened ideals. She invited German farmers to settle the lands. She expanded roadways and encouraged trade. She promoted Russian language and law. Some called it modernization. Others, quiet colonization, and both were true. Let's pause here for a moment. We often think of empire building as a man's game, brutal, bloody, unforgiving, and much of it is. But Catherine waged empire through intellect as much as invasion. She didn't just fight wars. She reshaped cultures. She didn't just capture cities. She planted futures. That doesn't make her above criticism. Many of her policies displaced local traditions. Her expansion of serfdom deepened inequality. And her ambitions sometimes crossed into arrogance. But here's the nuance. Catherine didn't expand Russia because she loved war. She expanded because she believed Russia belonged on the global stage, and she would do whatever it took to put it there. And it worked. By the end of her reign, Russia's borders had grown by over 200,000 square miles. But more than that, Russia had earned something even harder to win: respect. The courts of Europe, which once mocked Russia as backward and barbaric, now watched in awe. They studied her strategies. They copied her reforms. They feared her army and Catherine. She knew every inch of that new map because she had drawn it herself. But as her empire stretched outward, her world at court remained as complicated as ever, because if there was one realm Catherine could never fully conquer, it was love. Catherine ruled an empire. She commanded armies, redrew borders, and debated Enlightenment philosophy with Europe's greatest minds. But when her name was whispered in royal salons or shouted in scandalous pamphlets, it wasn't always about her policies or her victories. It was about her lovers. Yes, Catherine had them, many of them. Younger, handsome, often gifted men who played roles in her personal life and, sometimes, her political strategy. And for centuries, those relationships have fueled endless fascination, judgment, and outright fiction. But here's the truth. Catherine didn't hide her romantic life. She didn't apologize for it. She refused to be a shadow of a man's morality, judged by standards that never applied to emperors or kings. She was a woman, yes, but she was also an empress, and she lived both fully. Let's go back to the beginning. Catherine's marriage to Peter III was not a partnership. It was a prison. Cold, unconsummated, and filled with contempt. It left her isolated in a palace of eyes and expectations. She was married to power, but starved of affection. So when she found connection, first emotional, then romantic, she reached for it. Some of her early relationships were built in secrecy, like her bond with Sergei Saltykov, rumored to be the biological father of her son Paul. Others, like her long relationship with Grigory Orlov, were public and powerful. Orlov wasn't just a lover. He was one of the heroes of her coup, the man who rode beside her the day she took the throne. Brave, loyal, and intelligent, he gave her not just comfort, but political capital. Catherine rewarded him with titles, land, and a seat at her side, until the relationship faded. But perhaps her most important and enduring companion was Grigory Potemkin. Brilliant, wild, visionary. Potemkin wasn't just her equal in wit and ambition. He was her partner in empire. Some believe they were secretly married. Most agree they remained close long after their romantic involvement ended. He helped shape her southern conquests, designed new cities, and led armies in her name. They wrote letters that were passionate, intellectual, and deeply affectionate. Catherine called him my soul, my glory, and my friend. And even after their romance cooled, she trusted him more than anyone. Still, the court, and all of Europe, couldn't look past the fact that a woman, especially a powerful one, dared to have lovers. Men ruled with concubines, mistresses, and illegitimate children. Women, they were supposed to suffer quietly. Catherine didn't, and so came the rumors, the caricatures. The pamphlets filled with lies, including the most grotesque and completely false tale about her and a horse, a rumor designed not just to shock, but to humiliate. That lie has followed her for generations, not because it was true, but because the idea of a woman owning her power, body, and destiny was simply too threatening to some. But let's flip the lens. Catherine's lovers were often chosen with care. She didn't cling to them. She didn't let them rule her. They came. They loved. And when it was time, they left, with pensions, palaces, and respect. She managed relationships with the same precision she managed her court. And maybe that's the most subversive part of all. She showed the world that a woman could lead and still love. That desire didn't have to destroy duty. Yes, she was an empress with passions, but her heart never distracted her from her crown. Instead, she used love as a source of strength, not weakness. She surrounded herself with men who energized her, made her laugh, and stood beside her as equals, or knew when to step aside. So what's the lesson here? We are so often taught that leadership must be cold. That emotion is the enemy of control. That to be powerful, one must be distant. Catherine shattered that myth. She ruled as a whole person, not as a fragment of someone else's ideal. And by doing so, she gave permission, perhaps not to her time, but to ours, for women to lead with their full selves, with heart and strategy, with vision and vulnerability. And through it all, she kept writing, she kept ruling, she kept building. Because even though the world gossiped about her private life, Catherine never let it define her. She had one final act to write, a final test of power, and this time, it would come from within her own borders. For years, Catherine had ruled with a sense of forward motion. New schools, new cities, new laws. Her image, carefully shaped, was that of a philosopher queen. Enlightened, reasonable, a mother to the nation. But beneath the gilded halls of St. Petersburg, another Russia was stirring. A darker, angrier Russia, one that had never read Voltaire, one that didn't care about art collections or legal codes, one that lived in huts, bound to land they didn't own, and to lords they couldn't question. The serfs, they were the invisible. Hands that fed the empire, millions of them, tied to estates, often worked to the bone and punished without mercy. And in 1773, those hands clenched into fists. His name was Yemelyan Pugachev. A Don Cossack, charismatic and wild, with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. But what made him truly dangerous was his claim. He said he was Peter III, Catherine's late husband, alive and returned to reclaim his throne. Of course, it wasn't true. Peter was dead. Everyone knew it, but truth wasn't the point. To the poor and dispossessed, his story offered something far more powerful than facts. It offered hope. Pugachev promised freedom from serfdom, land of their own, lower taxes, an end to the cruel grip of the nobles. Word spread like fire on dry grass. Peasants, serfs, and Cossacks rallied behind him. Whole towns were taken, fortresses fell, landowners were killed, and suddenly, the Russian Empire, so vast, so seemingly immovable, began to shake. For Catherine, this was no ordinary uprising. This was an existential threat, a test not of her intellect, but of her hold on power. She had to make a choice. Would she lean on the ideals she had once written so passionately about, or would she protect the structure that had given her the throne? She chose the throne. Catherine dispatched the army. Thousands of professional troops, trained and ruthless, marched south to crush the rebellion. The response was brutal. Villages were burned. Rebels were executed. Anyone suspected of harboring Pugachev was dealt with swiftly. After nearly a year of chaos, he was captured, betrayed by his own men. He was put in an iron cage and paraded through the streets of Moscow, humiliated, broken, and eventually beheaded. Catherine had survived. But she was changed. The rebellion had revealed something she could never unsee. The Enlightenment was a beautiful dream, but Russia was still a feudal nightmare. And from that moment on, she hardened. She increased the power of the nobility, giving them even more control over their serfs, ensuring their loyalty. She tightened censorship and surveillance, wary of dangerous ideas spreading too fast. She stopped speaking quite so boldly about freedom and equality, and who could blame her? She had seen what happened when promises reached the ears of people with nothing to lose. But here's the paradox. Catherine still believed in progress. She still built schools. She still corresponded with philosophers. She still envisioned a modern Russia. But she now believed something else too. You can only reform what you control. And control, in Russia, meant holding down the foundation, even if that foundation was built on suffering. It's easy to judge her from the comfort of hindsight, but imagine standing where she stood, a foreign-born woman on the throne of a restless empire, surrounded by enemies abroad, depended on by nobles at home, trying to hold together a country split by class, language, religion, and rage. In that moment, idealism didn't feel noble. It felt dangerous. So she chose stability over sympathy. Order over openness, and perhaps that's the lesson. Power always has a cost. Sometimes that cost is paid in silence, sometimes in compromise, and sometimes in blood. Catherine paid the price to stay in power. But in doing so, she kept Russia from descending into chaos. She believed the country needed structure first, before freedom could ever be real. Whether history agrees is another story, but one thing is certain. After Pugachev, Catherine ruled differently, not just as a reformer, but as a survivor. And as the years went on, the girl who once rode into Russia wrapped in furs had now become something far greater and far more alone. Because even as her empire grew, her time was running short. Catherine died on a cold November morning in 1796. She passed away quietly in her beloved winter palace. No final battle, no dramatic collapse. Just the slow, inevitable stillness that comes for everyone, even empresses. And yet, the moment she left this world, a question rose in the silence she left behind. What did she leave behind? Not in gold, not in palaces, but in meaning. Because Catherine didn't inherit her title. She wasn't born into the Russian bloodline. She wasn't chosen by fate. She had no divine right to rule. She took power with nothing but her mind, her courage, and her will. She built it, piece by piece, moment by moment, heartbreak by heartbreak. And when she died, she had ruled Russia for 34 years, longer than any female leader in its history. But her true legacy? That lives not in the length of her reign, but in what she did with it. Let's talk about the facts first. Under Catherine's rule, Russia expanded by over 200,000 square miles. She reformed education, building schools and libraries in places where there had once only been dust and silence. She encouraged science, medicine, philosophy, and the arts. She brought Western ideas into the Russian court, not to replace tradition, but to challenge it, to stir the waters. She was the driving force behind the creation of the Hermitage Museum, one of the greatest cultural institutions in the world. She filled it with art, books, and light, because she believed beauty wasn't just decoration, it was inspiration. She promoted vaccination, even publicly getting inoculated against smallpox herself to show her people it was safe. She supported economic reform, modernized agriculture, and tried, however imperfectly, to bring law and order to a country weighed down by centuries of feudalism. She wasn't perfect. She failed to abolish serfdom. She compromised with the nobility too often. She sometimes ruled with a heavier hand than history would like. But here's the truth no one can deny. Catherine moved Russia forward, not with explosions, not with revolutions, but with relentless daily momentum. A letter, a law, a school, a city, a step, over and over again. She walked into the largest empire on earth as a teenage girl in a foreign land, and by the end of her life, she was the empire. And that transformation? That's not just political, it's deeply personal. Because Catherine's story isn't only about Russia, it's about reinvention. It's about being underestimated and dismissed and rising anyway. It's about being a woman in a world built for men and writing your own chapter in ink no one can erase. She was called many names, some flattering, some cruel. But the one that stuck, Catherine the Great, was not one she ever gave herself. It was earned, in whispers, in war rooms, in quiet reforms, in impossible decisions. And if we're being honest, it wasn't greatness in the modern sense. She wasn't always kind. She wasn't always fair, but she was brave, and she was real. She allowed herself to be complex, a ruler and a lover, a dreamer and a pragmatist, a woman of fire, flaws, and fierce clarity. Let's not forget, Catherine kept a diary. In it, she wrote not about gold or glory, but about loneliness. She wrote of being surrounded by people and still feeling utterly alone, of never quite being loved the way she loved, of giving everything to a country that never fully gave back. And that's where her legacy becomes not just royal, but human. Because in the end, Catherine wasn't a myth. She was a woman who lived, tried, failed, loved, conquered, learned, and built. She built her name, she built her power, and she built a version of Russia that stood taller because of her. So what can we take from her story? That greatness doesn't require perfection. It requires persistence. That power doesn't have to be given. It can be made. And that if you want to change the world, you don't need permission. You just need to begin. With one decision. One risk. One quiet refusal to disappear. Catherine didn't fade into history. She wrote it. And in doing so, she left behind more than a legacy. She left behind a question. What will you build? Now, before we leave Catherine's palace behind, let's travel somewhere else entirely, to another queen. One with no palace, one whose name was never carved into stone, one who ruled not through decree, but through mystery. She was wrapped not in velvet, but in red dust, not remembered in books, but in silence and jade. And yet, like Catherine, she shaped the world around her. Join us as we step into the jungle, into the tomb, into the quiet and sacred power of the Red Queen of Palanque. Because power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers across centuries. Hey friends, tonight, I want you to close your eyes and imagine this. You're standing deep in the jungles of southern Mexico. The air is thick with humidity. Vines hang like curtains from trees older than time. Birds cry out in strange, echoing voices. And just beyond the moss-covered stones and tangled branches is a forgotten city. Not a city of myths, a real one. Built by hand, by stone, by memory. It's called Palenque. Once the beating heart of a Maya kingdom, now quiet, except for the whispers of its past, and beneath one of its pyramids, hidden for more than 1,000 years, there's a chamber sealed in silence. No doorway, no markings, just cool stone and centuries of stillness, until one day, someone opened it. What they found wasn't gold. It wasn't treasure. It was a skeleton, a woman laid to rest with reverence, covered in crimson cinnabar, adorned in jade, powerful, respected, sacred, but with one haunting detail. No name. Who was she? A queen? A priestess? A ghost of an empire? Or something more? Tonight we're stepping into her tomb, not just to uncover her secrets, but to remember her, to honor a story that was never carved in stone, but still managed to survive the jungle, time, and silence. So dim your lights. Take a breath and join me as we walk into the red dust of history and meet a woman the world tried to forget, but couldn't, because power leaves a trace, even when the name is gone. In 1994, deep inside the ruins of Palenque, a team of archaeologists made a quiet discovery, one that would rewrite part of Maya history. They weren't looking for royalty that day. They were surveying Temple 13, a modest-looking pyramid standing humbly next to the grand, ornate Temple of the Inscriptions, the final resting place of Pacal the Great, one of the most legendary kings of the ancient Maya world. Most assumed Temple 13 had little left to say. It was smaller, simpler, forgotten. But sometimes, the most powerful voices come from the quietest places. A young archaeologist named Fanny Lopez Jimenez was studying cracks in the inner chamber when she noticed something odd, a sealed wall. Not just sealed, but intentionally hidden, with no entrance, no inscriptions, and no signs of looting. That alone was unusual. Most Maya tombs had been raided centuries ago. But this one, it was untouched, undisturbed, waiting. When the team carefully broke through the stone and descended inside, what they found wasn't just a tomb. It was a revelation. At the center lay a limestone sarcophagus, heavy and unadorned. The air was thick, dry, still, and when they opened the lid, red dust rose like smoke. Cinnabar. The skeleton inside had been completely covered in bright red mercury sulfide, a rare and sacred material to the Maya, symbolizing blood, life, transformation. Around her lay offerings, jade jewelry, carved shells, obsidian blades, bone needles, and ceramic vessels still sealed after more than 1,000 years. This was no ordinary burial. This was royal. But here's what stunned everyone. It wasn't a king. It wasn't even a man. It was a woman. And she had been laid to rest with the same reverence, wealth, and symbolism as Pacal himself, just a few feet away. No name. No inscription. Just the color red, the shine of jade, and the silence of centuries. To the modern world, she became known as the Red Queen. We still don't know for sure who she was. But that day, history cracked open, just like the wall. She'd been buried behind. It reminded us that power doesn't always come with a title, and that stories worth telling aren't always carved in stone. Sometimes they wait in dust. Sometimes it takes only one discovery to make us see everything differently, and that discovery led to another question, a more ancient, more sacred one. Why was her body painted red? Let's talk about that. The moment that sarcophagus opened and the red powder rose, it wasn't just dust. It was a message from over 1,300 years ago, spoken not in words, but in color. The Red Queen's bones weren't simply resting. They were bathed in cinnabar, also known as mercury sulfide. To us today, cinnabar is a toxic mineral. Prolonged exposure can damage the nervous system, even cause death. But to the ancient Maya, it was sacred. They believed cinnabar held the essence of life itself. Its brilliant crimson hue resembled blood, the most powerful offering in Maya cosmology. And blood wasn't just a bodily fluid. It was a cosmic connector, a bridge between humans and gods, life and death, earth and sky. So when the Red Queen was covered in cinnabar, it wasn't an accident. It was a ritual. It meant something profound. This woman wasn't being laid to rest. She was being reborn. In Maya belief, death wasn't the end. It was a transition, a passage into the underworld, or Xibalba, where souls faced trials before, rejoining the cycle of life. Cinnabar, with its vivid color and sacred symbolism, was used to prepare the dead for that journey. It was both protection and declaration. This soul mattered. This soul had power. Only the most important elite, rulers, high priests, and select royalty, were granted this red blessing. And here's something even more telling. In all of Palenque, only 2 burials have ever been discovered drenched in cinnabar. One was Pakal the Great. The other was her. That's not coincidence. It's connection. It tells us this woman stood shoulder to shoulder with a king. She wasn't secondary. She wasn't ornamental. She was essential. Maybe a queen, maybe a spiritual leader, maybe both. Whatever her title, the cinnabar told us what the silence could not. She held a place of extraordinary importance in a world that rarely carved women's names in stone. And in a way, this red powder still speaks. It reminds us that what we honor says everything about what we value. The Maya didn't just bury her with riches, they buried her with symbolism, with transformation, with the essence of life itself. And that leads us to what lay around her, the sacred treasures placed with care, like a map for the afterlife. Let's take a closer look at what she brought with her into eternity. When the Red Queen's tomb was opened, it wasn't just the red dust that stunned the archaeologists. It was what lay within it. Quiet objects, simple in form, but heavy with meaning. Her body was surrounded by offerings, deliberate, symbolic, and sacred. The most striking among them? Jade. Necklaces draped across her chest, bracelets circling her wrists, ear spools, beads, and ornaments nestled around. Her bones. To the ancient Maya, jade wasn't just a pretty gem. It was life. Its deep green shimmer symbolized the sacred maize plant, the lifeblood of their civilization, and the breath of the gods. It stood for fertility, power, eternity. Only, the elite were buried with jade, and this woman? She was drenched in it. And then there was the mask, delicately assembled over her face. It wasn't a single carved piece like those of ancient Egypt. No, this was a mosaic, tiny slivers of jade pieced together like a puzzle, crafted to mirror the contours of her face. It wasn't made for beauty. It was made for recognition. In Maya belief, the face was a reflection of the soul. When a person passed into the afterlife, they needed to be recognized by the gods. The mask wasn't a disguise. It was a passport, a declaration, this is who I am. I belong. Alongside the jade were obsidian blades, tools of ceremony perhaps, used in bloodletting rituals. Bone needles and pins, likely signs of status, healing, or sacred duties. Ceramic vessels sat at her feet, possibly once filled with chocolate, pulque, or offerings to sustain her journey. This wasn't a treasure chest. It was a survival kit for the underworld, each item chosen not for its monetary value, but for its spiritual function. It's easy to look at ancient burial artifacts and see wealth. But in truth, The Maya weren't burying riches. They were burying meaning. These weren't luxuries. They were necessities, tools to help her cross the many layers of Xibalba, the Maya underworld. And that brings us to something deeper. We bury people, not just to say goodbye, but to help them move forward. And the Maya, they wanted this woman to move forward with dignity, strength, and recognition. That tells us everything we need to know. She mattered, deeply. Even if her name was lost, her preparation for eternity tells us someone loved her, respected her, honored her enough to give her a map for the next world. But the question remains, who was she? Who would receive such a sacred burial? Let's explore the mystery behind her missing name and the theories that just might reveal her true identity. She had jade. She had cinnabar. She had a face made of mosaic and a tomb sealed tighter than any other. But the one thing she didn't have was a name. No inscription, no carved glyph, no royal title, just silence. And yet, from that silence rises one of the loudest truths. This woman held power. So who was she? The theories began almost as soon as the tomb was opened. Some believe she was Zakkuk, the wife of King Pakal the Great, the most celebrated ruler of Palanque. Her tomb sits just a few feet from his, and both were buried with nearly identical rituals, cinnabar covering, jade adornments, and sacred positioning. It makes sense. Zakkuk was more than just a consort. She was of noble blood, gave birth to Pakal's heirs, and likely played an active role in court life. But there's another contender, Zakkuk, Pakal's mother, a woman who actually ruled Palanque as queen in her own right before passing the throne to her son. She wasn't a placeholder, she was a sovereign. And if anyone deserved a sacred tomb next to her son, it might be her. There's even the possibility she was a high priestess, a spiritual leader whose authority came not from marriage or bloodline, but from divine role. So which theory is correct? Even modern science has tried to solve the mystery. DNA analysis was conducted on the Red Queen and on Pakal's remains. The result? No direct maternal link. That may rule out Zakkuk, but it doesn't eliminate a spousal relationship. But here's something to hold on to. Regardless of the missing name, the ritual says it all. In Maya culture, names were recorded for rulers, for the politically powerful, for those whose identities served dynasties. But maybe the Red Queen's story was meant to be spiritual, not political. Maybe she wasn't remembered with words, because her life was written in ritual. And in a way, that's even more powerful, because she still speaks, in jade, in dust, in the way her tomb tells a story without a single word. She had no name, but she had presence, and that's a lesson for all of us. You don't need to be famous to matter. You don't need to be remembered in books to have shaped the world around you. Sometimes, just living a life of meaning is enough to leave a trace. But the Red Queen's story also opens up a deeper conversation, one about women in Maya society, and how their power often lived in places the history books forgot. So let's look closer at those women, not the myths, but the real queen makers of the ancient world. When we think of ancient power, we often picture kings on thrones, warriors in gold, or names carved into stone walls. But what if some of the most powerful figures in Maya history never shouted their names? What if they whispered instead, through ritual, through family, through legacy? That's where the women come in. Maya society was complex. It had kings, dynasties, lineages that were passed down, usually through men. And yet women were often the glue holding that structure together, even if their stories weren't told as loudly. Let's go back to Zakkuk, for example, mother of Pakal the Great. When the royal throne of Palanque was left vacant after a political crisis, Zakkuk stepped in, not as a temporary figurehead, but as a ruling queen. She held power for 3 years, overseeing construction projects and religious ceremonies, until her son came of age. Without her leadership, Pakal's famous reign may never have happened. She didn't just protect the throne, she preserved the entire dynasty. Across the Maya world, we see signs of this silent strength. In cities like Yaxchilan and Calakmul, stone steles show women dressed in ceremonial regalia, performing bloodletting rituals, presiding over sacred rites. Some are queens, others are priestesses. All are crucial. In fact, some women appear on more public monuments than their husbands, because their bloodlines were considered more prestigious. Think about that. In a society that etched history into limestone, many women's names still didn't survive. But their influence did, in temples, in tombs, in the very shape of Maya civilization. They were diplomats. They were spiritual anchors. They were educators of kings and bearers of sacred lineage, and they didn't need to raise their voices to be heard. That's something we sometimes forget today. We measure success by spotlight, by applause. But the Maya remind us, power can live in silence. It can flow through those who hold the stories, raise the children, lead the rituals, and make sure the next ruler is ready. And maybe that's who the Red Queen was. Not a ruler in name, but a ruler in influence. A woman whose strength shaped the empire, not through conquest, but through presence. And if we want to fully understand her, we also need to understand the sacred space she was buried in. Because in the Maya world, even the placement of a tomb spoke volumes. So let's step back and look at where she was laid, to rest, and why it mattered more than we ever realized. At first glance, Temple the Three doesn't seem extraordinary. It sits quietly beside the towering Temple of the Inscriptions, where Pakal the Great lies in a tomb filled with elaborate carvings and a world-famous stone lid. Tourists flock to that temple every year, but Temple the Theed, it's humbler, smaller, unassuming. And that's what makes it so easy to overlook and so remarkable, because sometimes the most sacred places aren't built to impress the living. They're built to guide the dead. Let's step inside. Unlike Pakal's temple, the Red Queen's tomb had no staircase, no obvious entryway. It was tucked deep within the pyramid, sealed behind solid walls. The only way in was to break through. That tells us something right away. This tomb wasn't meant to be visited. It was meant to stay hidden, untouched, eternal. Inside, the chamber is stark. No glyphs, no murals, no ornate inscriptions, but silence. Doesn't mean emptiness. It means intention. The room itself is small, cool, and cut with care. The sarcophagus sits perfectly aligned from east to west, mirroring the sun's daily journey across the sky. That wasn't an accident. For the Maya, the sun's movement symbolized life to death and back again, a powerful metaphor for rebirth. Even the absence of decoration might have had meaning. While other tombs told stories and carvings, this one spoke through stillness, a private space perhaps meant only for the gods, and for her. And then there's location. Temple the Theed is just a few steps away from Pakal's great monument. That proximity wasn't random, it was deliberate. In Maya cosmology, rulers and sacred individuals were often buried in relation to cosmic alignments and dynastic significance. Laying the Red Queen beside Pakal may have symbolized a spiritual partnership, not just wife and husband, but sun and moon, masculine and feminine, power and balance. Even in death, they were part of a cosmic design. It reminds us that in the ancient world, architecture wasn't just functional, it was philosophical. Every wall, every angle, every step was a message, and the message here was clear. This woman mattered. She was more than noble. She was necessary, and maybe that's the lesson. You don't need the biggest monument to leave the deepest imprint. Sometimes, quiet reverence leaves the longest shadow. But her final resting place was only part of the story. To truly understand her journey, we need to follow her beyond the tomb, into the world that comes after. Let's explore the Maya vision of death, not as an ending, but as a sacred passage through Xibalba, the underworld. To the ancient Maya, death wasn't an end. It was a crossing. A sacred passage into a realm called Xibalba, the underworld. But don't picture a dark void or peaceful afterlife. Xibalba was far more complex, far more demanding. It was a place of trials. According to Maya mythology, the soul had to pass through 9 layers of hardship, rivers of blood, jaguars waiting in darkness, halls of knives, and trickster gods who tested a soul's courage and clarity. This wasn't a punishment. It was a rite of passage. To be reborn, you had to prove your spirit. To become whole again, you had to endure the sacred breaking. And that's why the Red Queen wasn't buried with treasures. She was buried with tools. Each offering, the jade mask, the obsidian blades, the sealed vessels, wasn't for show. They were preparations for the journey ahead. The mask helped her soul be recognized. The cinnabar shielded her spirit. The vessels may have carried sustenance for the road, perhaps chocolate or maize drink, believed to strengthen the soul during its voyage. Some of the sharp objects near her bones, bone needles, stingray spines, obsidian blades, might even symbolize auto-sacrifice, a sacred ritual where elite Maya would draw their own blood to honor the gods. If she had been a spiritual figure, she may have performed these rites in life, and now carried the symbols with her in death. Imagine this for a moment. A woman, once draped in ceremony, now dressed for her greatest one yet. Not just lying in a tomb, but preparing for a cosmic journey. Not remembered in stone, but trusted by the heavens. In Maya belief, if the soul completed the trials of Xibalba, it could be reborn, perhaps as a star, a plant, or even as an ancestor who watches over the living. Death wasn't goodbye. It was transformation. And the Red Queen's burial, from the cinnabar to the mask to the hidden temple, was all designed to give her the best chance at crossing. That tells us everything about how deeply she was honored. It also reminds us that we too shape the meaning of death, not by how we bury, but by how we remember. And while the Maya believed in transformation through myth and ritual, they also believed that the placement of a soul's tomb said something eternal, which brings us back to her most mysterious connection, her closeness to Pakal the Great. Because in the Maya world, where you are buried is just as meaningful as how. So let's talk about what it means when 2 rulers, one remembered in glyphs, the other only in red, are placed side by side. In the grand narrative of Maya history, Pakal the Great stands tall. He ruled Palenque for nearly 70 years. He commissioned massive temple complexes, expanded the city's power, and left behind a sarcophagus so detailed, so iconic, that it's been called the Rosetta Stone of Maya cosmic belief. And yet, just steps away from his massive tomb, in a much quieter chamber, lies the Red Queen, not beneath a temple with carvings, not beneath a roof full of stories, but in silence. And that silence has made many people assume something, that she was less important, just a wife, just a companion, just a shadow. But the truth might be much bolder. Because what if she wasn't behind Pakal? What if she stood beside him? Let's start with the obvious, burial treatment. Only 2 individuals in Palenque were buried with full-body cinnabar, jade jewelry, sacred artifacts, and sealed stone coffins inside pyramids. One was Pakal. The other was her. This was no accident. Cinnabar was expensive, dangerous to mine, reserved for the most sacred dead. And she was covered in it. Their tombs were positioned close together, almost like twin altars, the sun and the moon, masculine and feminine, power in cosmic balance. This pairing was deeply intentional in Maya belief. The universe was built on duality, on sacred counterparts. Kings and queens didn't just rule together. They represented 2 halves of a larger cosmic design. Some scholars now believe that the Red Queen may not have been merely Pakal's wife, but perhaps a spiritual equal, a priestess queen, or even a co-ruler whose role was ceremonial, dynastic, and deeply honored. And here's the powerful twist. Pakal's name is carved in stone. Hers is written in ritual. In the West, we often think of legacy as something shouted, sculpted, recorded. But in Maya culture, it could be whispered, expressed through burial, space, and spiritual symbolism. She wasn't forgotten. She was protected, and maybe that's the lesson here. Sometimes, the people who matter most aren't always the loudest. Their influence isn't always in documents. It's in decisions, in presence, in the lives they shape without needing to be seen. The Red Queen wasn't a lesser figure in Pakal's shadow. She was a pillar beside him, silent, steady, sacred. And that brings us to the most haunting part of her story. Because even now, even after all we've uncovered, her tomb, her mask, her jade, her power, there's still one thing we can't answer. Who was she really? Maybe we'll never know. But maybe that's not the point. Let's finish this journey by looking at what the Red Queen leaves behind, not just in mystery, but in meaning. When the Red Queen's tomb was discovered in 1994, it had been sealed for over 2,300 years. No name, no inscription, no voice. Just red dust and silence. And yet, when her bones were lifted from the stone and light touched her jade-studded mask for the first time in centuries, she spoke, not in words, but in presence. Because sometimes, history doesn't leave behind full stories. Sometimes it leaves behind puzzles, echoes, whispers. And in those whispers, we can still feel something powerful. She was not forgotten. Even if the Maya didn't record her name in glyphs, they remembered her in the way that mattered most to them, through ritual, placement, reverence. Her burial was not rushed, it was intentional. Her artifacts were not random, they were sacred. Her tomb was not grand. It was guarded, and that kind of care only happens when someone mattered deeply. It makes you wonder, how many people throughout history have shaped dynasties, guided rulers, held families, and preserved culture, without ever getting their name? In the book, the Red Queen stands for all of them. The unnamed women, the silent leaders, the ones whose impact is still felt, even if their stories have been washed by time. It's easy to think that if history forgets your name, it forgets your worth. But maybe she teaches us the opposite. Maybe real legacy isn't always about being remembered in words. Maybe it's about being remembered in ritual, in care, in how your presence shaped the lives around you. And here we are, over 1,000 years later, still wondering about her, still telling her story, still feeling the weight of her red-covered bones. That's not forgetting, that's remembrance in its purest form. So yes, her name is lost, but her meaning? Never. And that's why we return to her, because in trying to piece together who she was, we end up reflecting on who we are and how we choose to value the past. Now, to bring it all full circle, let's pause. Let's look one. Last time at her resting place, the mask, the cinnabar, the silence. Let's ask ourselves what it really means to matter, not just in history, but in life. And in this final moment, we'll find that the Red Queen's story isn't just about who she was. It's about what she left behind. She didn't leave behind speeches. She didn't write manifestos or command armies. She didn't even leave her name. And yet here we are, still speaking of her, still trying to understand the story she left behind in red powder and stone. So what does the Red Queen truly teach us? Maybe it's this. That impact doesn't always come with a spotlight. Sometimes, the people who shape the world the most aren't the loudest in the room. They're the ones who hold families together, the ones who lead with steadiness, the ones who care deeply and act quietly. In a world that celebrates visibility, we forget to honor the unseen. But the Maya didn't forget. They buried her with care. They wrapped her in cinnabar. They placed her beside kings. Not because she was ordinary, but because she was essential. And that message still matters today. Think about the women in your own life, your mother, your grandmother, your teacher, your quiet mentor. Maybe they didn't write books or stand on stages, but they built you piece by piece with presence, love, and unwavering strength. The Red Queen speaks for them. She reminds us that legacy isn't just what gets remembered. Legacy is what gets passed on. A lesson, a value, a tradition, a steady hand that guided others. And though she ruled centuries ago, from within a jungle kingdom now crumbled, her story whispers something timeless. You don't have to be carved into stone to leave a mark. You just have to live with meaning. That's why archaeologists keep returning to her tomb, why historians keep debating her identity, why artists paint her, poets write about her, and filmmakers imagine her voice, because there's something deeply human in her silence, something that mirrors all of us. Most of us won't be famous. Most of us won't be remembered by name hundreds of years from now. But if we live with purpose, with grace, with quiet strength, then maybe, like the Red Queen, we don't disappear. Maybe we just become part of the story, a soft but lasting thread in the fabric of time. And now, as we step back from the tomb, from the jade, from the dust, we carry her with us, not just as a mystery, but as a reminder. That power isn't always loud. That love can echo beyond lifetimes. And that silence, when filled with meaning, can become eternal. And so, we leave her, the Red Queen, wrapped in red, lying in silence beneath stone and centuries. We may never know her name, but maybe we don't need to, because her story was never just about her identity. It was about her presence, her ritual, her place beside kings, and the quiet echo of power that never needed to shout. In every sealed jar, every shard of jade, every careful placement of her body, we see devotion. We see honor. We see legacy, not written in books, but held in breathless reverence. And maybe that's the real miracle, that across 1 in 300 years through the soil and shadows, she still found a way to speak to us, not with words, but with meaning. If this story touched something in you, if it made you pause, reflect, or remember someone in your life who shaped you quietly, carry that with you. Because legacy isn't about being seen by everyone. It's about being felt by someone. Thank you for joining us on this journey, through stone temples, sacred silence, and the lasting voice of a woman history tried to forget, but never could. Until next time, take care of your story. It matters.